sure to send a chill down your spine. A welling sound sliced through the twilight air, thin and keen as a razor. It wasn't just a mere noise, it was music, undeniably beautiful, yet underscored by a primal, deeply unsettling quality that vibrated in the very bones of the listener. The chilling melody, which seemed to carry on cold whispers of the wind, was the bane and fascination of Oak Haven. The villagers abandoned long ago any attempt to describe the music with any common terms. They called it simply the flute, and the name held the weight of dread and recognition. Everyone knew what it meant. It wasn't the sweet, convivial sound of a shepherd's pipe or a minstrel tune. It was a herald. It signaled in drawing near of the thing that played it, a creature or perhaps a spirit that had dared not be named in the fate of life. Tonight, as the sun dipped behind the jagged, black outline of the whisperwood, and the shadows stretched like grasping claws across the muddy village lanes, the sound was closer than it had been in months. It spoke of movement, of a slow, inevitable descent from the high mist, shrewded peaks, and into the valleys where the homes stood huddled against the coming night. Windows were swiftly shuttered, and locks, mostly symbolic, against such a power, were bolted. Mothers pulled their children tighter, and the men of the village gripped their axes and pitchforks, knowing they offered little protection, but offering them all the same. The flute's song was their grim clock, its increasing volume a countdown to horrors to the deepest night. The tune began softly, seemingly distant, a lone tune that curled around corners and sipped through doors, an auscultic phantom haunting the edges of awareness. It was a single vibration that seemed to pluck at the very threads of silence, but swiftly, audibly, it grew. It wasn't the sound of explosion, but a rattle, insidious, winding tuned to complex, hypnotic melody. Each subjugated note was an invitation, weaving itself into impersonation, tapestry of sound that seemed to bypass the ears entirely, sinking into the listener's core. This was no ordinary music. It was a true silent song, one that resonated with the deep, vacant places within the soul, the hollows carved out by the years of striving, suffering, and existential fatigue. The melody spoke a language of ultimate resignation and sweet oblivion. It promised an absolute profound peace, a state not merely of rest, but of cessation. It offered an end to a ceaseless cycle of worry, the relentless pressure of existence, the burdensome weight of consciousness itself. It was a whisper of a final bliss, silence, a deep and unassailable quietude, where all effort, all pain, and all memory would dissolve. First, it was the young ones who heard it. Their pause, mid conversation, their eyes glazing over with a vacant, distant look, as if their inner world had suddenly been replaced by a boundless echo chamber. A subtle, almost impeccable tremor would run through them, a visible sign of Internal shift. It began with the faint, persistent drone, a music unlike any they had heard. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute weaving itself into the every fabric of their attention. Then, with an unnatural calm that chilled those who watched, they would rise. They didn't walk, they glided, their movements unwavering, smooth, and devoid of any human hesitation. Their feet seemed barely to disturb the dust on the floor, their bodies held in a rigid, almost barbaric posture. This wasn't a choice, it was an irresistible compulsion. The music had found its conductors, and their destination was clear. They were following the sound, a silent, growing procession drawn by an invisible, hypnotic melody that promised something. The older villagers, bewildered and terrified, would reach out to stop them, only to find the younger ones, skin cold and unresponsive, beneath their frantic grip, their minds already far away, already belonging to the siren song. The hypnotic, low thrum, a sound like a vast, low beating heart deep beneath the earth, pulled them inexorably toward the whispering woods. It wasn't music, nor was it the voice, yet it burrowed into their minds, a primal call that they couldn't ignore, stripping away consciousness, though, until only the urged need to follow remained. The trees of the woods themselves seemed to lean in, their ancient gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers, ushering them toward their destination, the jagged maw of the serpent's mouth cave. From a distance, the cave entrance appeared less than a natural opening and more like a wound in the earth, a vertical tear in the gray moss stained rock face. Even on the sunniest, brightest high noonday, when the canopy above was a shimmering expanse of a gold and green that seemed to actively consume the light around it as they drew near. A palpable chill radiated from the abyss, a bone deep cold that had nothing to do with the external temperature. It carried a sickening familiar odor, too faint metallic tang of old dried blood, mixed with the clean, sharp bite of freezing air, as if the cave were exhaling the icy breath of a long dead winter. It promised a profound, terrifying secret deep within its cold throat, a secret they would now compelled to discover, no matter the cost. Tonight the flute's call was louder than ever, a haunting eternal melody that seemed to snake through the very walls of the hum-lit cabin. It was the sound that didn't just vibrate the air, it vibrated the bones, a seductive promise whispered on the chill wind. Old man Himlock, his face a road map of worry etched by years of living too close to the woods, and its ancient unholy music felt the familiar cold dread tighten his chest. He watched in horror as his daughter Sarah, a girl known for her quiet strength and practical good sense, responded to the invisible summons. She was stepping over the threshold, moving as if walking in trance. Her simple nightgown fluttered slightly, but her pace was unnervingly steady, deliberate. Her hands were clasped loosely at her waist, a pose of unnatural, almost irrealistic calm. What truly terrified him was the expression on her face, a look of serene idiocy, a vacant, euphotic smile that suggested her mind was miles away, utterly empty of her own will, and filled instead with the flute's wicked enchantment. Her eyes, unusually so bright and sharp, were unfocused, gazing at some point far beyond the back lines of the trees. He lunged for her, his old body protesting with a sharp pain in his back. He managed to grab her arm just above the elbow, with a grip fierce in desperation. But her skin was cold, unnaturally so, like marble that had been lain in the winter ground, and strangely resistant, taut, and unyielding under his clasped hand. It was as if he were trying to stop a statue from moving, not his own flesh and blood. Sarah! His voice said, choked, ragged whisper, a plea from an undying hope. But the girl didn't even flinch. She simply continued her steady, inevitable movement toward the dense, suffocating darkness, from which the flute's memorizing song was now emanating. With a sickening, irresistible sweetness, he pulled harder, his knuckles white, but she was already half turned to the night, her momentum and the flute's power proving too great for his failing strength. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the dim walls of the room, perhaps an unseen horizon or a memory too painful to face head on. Her body was still like a statue, curved for recognition, only the faint, steady rise and fall of her chest indicating life. When she finally spoke, the sound was barely a breath, a flat and toneless murmur that seemed to emanate from a great distance. The music calls, she said, the words stripped of all passion of hope. It is a siren song, not of joy, but of necessity finality. She swallowed, a movement barely predictable in the stark light. It demands an answer, an attendance that cannot be postponed, ere journey one must undertake alone. A long pause stretched between them, thick with the weight of unspoken grief and understanding. And silence waits, she continued, her voice trailing off to a whisper that felt colder than the air itself. It is only true destination left, a deep, infinite peace, where the dissonance of the final life ceases, for the melodies of the world fade, and there are only the vast enfolding quiet. She offered no explanation, no apology, and no promise of return, leaving him with the stark, chilling poetry of her departure. Hemlock watched, a knot of icy dread tightening in his stomach as Sarah joined the growing spectral possession. She had moved with a strange, unnerving serenity, her eyes wide and vacant, fixed on a point far beyond the flickering firelight of their desperate enchantment. It was a nightmare played out in slow motion. Young children, barely able to walk, were intercepted with stooped, gray-haired elders. The strong, coerced hands of the village blacksmith marched alongside the delicate, trembling fingers of the weaver. They moved on one, a silent, enchanted parade of humanity, utterly stripped of individual will. The sound of hundreds of bare or simple shoed foot was a soft, relentless shushing in the dust, the only sound besides the faint, unsettling drone that seemed to emanate from the very earth. Their destination was the dark, the maw of the cave, a jagged black hole carved into the base of the forgotten mountain. Waited patiently. It was a place of ill rupture and chilling legend, yet now, under this impeccable spell, it beckoned like a sanctuary. Each person who reached the lip of the cave hesitated for only a second, a final minute twitch of muscle before dissolving into the absolute gloom. Hemlock gripped the rough wooden haft of his axe, his knuckles white. The cold steel felt like the only anchor to reality in his unsurreal horror. He had tried to stop Sarah, had yelled her name until his throat was raw, and even attempted to physically restrain her. But her strength, or whatever force was moving her, was immense, inhuman. She had simply pushed past him with the indifferent cease of a wave passing over a pebble. Now, as the last stragglers, a limping shepherd and a mother, clutching an empty shawl, vanished into the cave, a profound, terrifying silence descended. Hemlock was alone. The fire had seemed so comforting minutes ago. Now, casting dancing shadows that mocked his solitude, he knew he should flee, seek help, but his legs felt cemented to the ground. Sarah was in there, and in the face of his incomparable terror, his helplessness was the heaviest burden of all. Deep within the cave, where the air grew thick in the scent damp of earth, and the lingering ooze of forgotten energies, the music finally reached its agonizing peak. It was not a gentle cadence, but a violent screeching flute, like pain that shattered the opposing silence, accumulating in a devastating crystalline climax that seemed to tear at the very fabric of Siberian darkness. And in the wake of that sonic violence, something was waiting. It was impossibly tall, a gigantic skeletal monument to phantom and fear. Its shadow, cast by the domestic fungi, clinging to the wet rock, stretched and withered, dwarfing the cave's immense size, a rock of colossal antlers, twisted and black like fire scorched wood, scraped against the jagged ceiling with a sound like grinding stone, showering dust and brittle rock. Fragments onto the cave floor, where eyes should have been. Two pools of ancient, starving fire burned, a hunger malevolent amber that seemed to devour the light rather than reflect it. This was no mere beast. It was a horrifying alignment of a man and a mirror, a purity of life twisted by the unforgiving wilderness, and a terrible, insatiable hunger. Its emaciated limbs ended in razor sharp claws, and its body was a tapestry of stretched, its skin barely clinging to bone. It was a creature of winter's final desperate cold. A Wendigo. It had been drawn from the deep woods by the shattering, high pitched resonating of music, lured by the promise of warmth and flesh. After a millennium of silent, icy solitude, the cave for so long had been a tomb, had become a terrible cradle for its awakening. The flute stopped. The silence that followed a cessation of the flute's maddening music was absolutely heavier and colder than any noise that could ever be heard. It was a crushing vacuum left by a stolen consciousness. The villagers, dozens of them, stood before the looming skeletal creature. The Wendigo, their bodies utterly still, their faces pale, masks of vacant serenity. Their trance was unbroken, a perfect sinister stillness that mirrored the dead winter forest around them. They were statues, yet they were not dead. They were merely waiting, their wills entirely subsumed. The Wendigo let out a loud sound, a terrible, wet, raspy, that was less of a roar and more of a hunger elastic sigh. It was the perfect gruesome inference of the flute's earlier bewailing sweet call, the creature's gruntal frame, a nightmare of bone and sinew, stretched over impossible height, shimmering faintly in the weak pre-dawn light. It was not a devourer of mere flesh, not primarily. That common myth was crude, simplification of its horrific function. The Wendigo was a consumer of souls, a collector of intrinsic light and warmth of the living conscience. It needed the flesh only as a vessel, an anchor, a biological cage to keep the soul fresh, potent, and exquisite. Terrified until the moment of final consumption, a low gruntal vibration ran through the ground as the creature shifted its weight on its unnatural hoofed feet. Its eyes, twin points of ancient malevolent ice, surveyed the silent, passive crowd with chilling patience. The harvest had begun. There was no struggle, no scream, no resistance to savor, only the appalling cease of plucking a perfectly ripe fruit. The flute, the instrument of silent massacre, lay abandoned and harmless looking on the moss covered stone ledge some distance away. Its wooden case, smooth and unremarkable, betrayed none of the soul shredded power it possessed. It had done its work for the night, lulling the callous into a state of blissfulness, sacrificial catatonal. Now, silence and enter it, which was already preparing its tune for the next moonrise, drawing its strength from the psychic echoes of the horror it enabled, ready to repeat the cycle in a new village under a fresh, unsuspecting sky. The terror was not the monster, but the cold, beautiful inevitable of its lure. Thank you for listening to Creep Night.